Hello, everybody. We're going to go quickly over the differences between arrays and array lists. This is focused on just how do you do the basic things like create them, put values into them, get values out of them, ask them how long they are, that kind of thing. You might want, instead of listening to me talk, to just skim the notes. This is the written notes. Don't read it here, but you can open the PDF. This is everything I'm going to tell you in the video. It's just that I'm going to explain it in the video. If you learn better by typing along, stop this video and go to the next one, which is the same stuff, only typing along. Okay, so without further ado, here's how you create arrays and array lists. The pattern for declaring a variable is always the same. You have data type followed by variable name. So for an array is going to be a list of variables. So you have to say, if I'm going to have 10 variables, what data type should each individual variable be? So that's what the data type is at the beginning of an array, followed by brackets. So int bracket bracket means I want an array of ints. String bracket bracket means I want an array of strings. Boolean would be an array of booleans. Person bracket bracket would mean an array of person objects. So arrays can hold primitive data types like int. It can also hold, or they can also hold object data types like person. So the data type for the array would be this entire int bracket bracket, and then the name of the variable for the array is int list. Int list represents the entire list of all of the variables. To initialize them, you would have an equals sign, and then the keyword new, and then the data type again, but this time inside the square brackets, you'd have the length that you want the list to be. So this is creating a list of 100 integers. Here's 5,000 strings, 100 booleans, or 10 person objects. Notice that when you create an array, you have to say how long you want it to be to start with. Arrays can never get longer or shorter. They're created to be a fixed size right when you first initialize them. Array lists, by contrast, you'll notice that over here I don't have any numbers for how large I want them to be, because array lists are always created of size 0, and then as you add things to the list, they dynamically expand to become longer. So that's one of the nice things about array lists, is they're a flexible version of arrays. The way that you declare them is with the word array list, and then using triangle brackets and the data type inside the triangle brackets. An important thing to know about array list is that you can't make an array list of a primitive data type. Lowercase int is primitive, lowercase boolean is primitive. But if you want, it's pretty normal to want a list of integers. So for an array list, you have to use the object version of lowercase int, which is capital I integer. This is called a wrapper class. We'll talk more about this later. But for now, the only thing to realize is for each of the data types that are primitive, there is a corresponding object version that's just what you might guess it to be. They always start with a capital letter. Okay. So I've already said that arrays, you create them with to be a fixed size. The size can't change. You can store either primitive data types or objects, but you, unlike languages like Python, in a single list, you can't mix an int and then a string and then a person object and then another int. And the same is true of array lists as well. So it's going to be a list of a single data type. Just a side note here, if you know about capital O object, of course you could make the list be data type object and then store whatever data types you want in there. We're not going to talk about that right now. And I think that the use cases for that are not terribly common in Java. Okay, array lists, they expand and contract as you add and remove elements. Can't hold primitives, but what's nice about them is there's a whole bunch of predefined methods that you can use to sort them or to shuffle them or to do various things with them, as you'll see. Sometimes it's convenient to be able to create them with values already there. And you'll see this a lot in other people's code and on the AP test. So in order to create a string array that's length 3 that already has names in it, you use you use curly braces like this with a comma-separated list of the values that you want to initialize your array with. So here it's a string array with Bob, Sal, and Lars. Here there's an int array with a whole bunch of ints separated by commas. The way that you would do the same thing for an array list is a little bit longer. You would say new array list with the triangle brackets. And then inside the parentheses, you have this. You say capital A arrays dot as list, and then you have the comma separated values that you want to initialize your array list with. So here, I just ran out of space for Lars, but you got Bob and Sal. Arrays.asList takes Bob and Sal and creates a list out of them. And then that list is input to the ArrayList constructor, which makes an array list out of them. So anyway, this is just the exact same thing as the one on the left here. And it's pretty common to want to do this. For accessing values, the big contrast here is for array, you use the name of the array, followed by square brackets and the index you want to access. For array list, you have the name of the list, and then dot, and then the word get, followed by the value you want to access. Other than that, it's exactly the same. So this top line, we're accessing index 0, which is the first element of the list. Here in the middle, we're accessing the value at the 10th index, which is actually the 11th thing in the list. Square brackets for arrays, dot get for array lists, and so on. The way that you get the number of things in the list, for an array, you would say the name of the array followed by dot length. There's no parentheses because this is an attribute of the array object. For array lists, use dot size with parentheses because it's a method of the array list class. These things are not easy to keep in your own memory if you don't use them a lot. So I'll probably have these posted on the side of the room. By the end of the first semester, you'll be using both of these enough. You should just have it memorized. But in the first semester, I would say always just have a reference in front of you where you can look it up because it's silly to try and remember them. It's convenient to be able to get a random value out of an array or an array list. And so this is just putting stuff together that we've done already. To get any value out of an array, I would have the name of the array followed by the index inside the square brackets. Well, all I'm doing here is I have an expression that's going to evaluate to be a random number between 0 and the length of the list. And so what I'm doing here, let me break this green part out here. So the green part is rendered here, and then it will evaluate to be a random index, and then I'm accessing that random index in my array. So you could have it as 2 lines, or you could have it as 1 line. For array list, it's just the same. The only difference is you use .get instead of the square brackets, and you use .size instead of .length. To add things to the list, for arrays, remember you can't make arrays larger or smaller, so you're always overwriting a value that was already there. So here I'm taking the value 10 and I'm overwriting what used to be in index 0. Here I'm creating a new person object and I'm replacing what used to be in index 5. For array list, you have a bunch of options. If you say add, that will make your array list one variable longer by adding the new value to the end of the list. So this is putting a 10 at the end of the list. There's also a version of add where you specify the index first, followed by the value. So this is going to insert the name bingo at index 0, and whatever it was that used to be at index 0 has now shifted up to be at index 1. So everything else shifts up to accommodate that new variable at the beginning. But of course, you could have whatever index you want in here. The last option would be set. Set will actually replace whatever used to be at index 5 with the new value, and that's more like what you have to do with an array. Just a quick note that accessing the last value in an array is a little bit tricky if you're new to programming. Imagine if I have an array that's length 3, that means there are 3 things. What's the index of the last thing? The first thing is index 0, the next thing is index 1, the next thing is index 2. So my thing that was length 3, the last element has index 2. So the last index is always one smaller than the number of things in the list. So the way that you access the last element is first you ask your list, what's the total number of things, and then you subtract 1, and then you use that as the index that you want to access. And that's what's happening here. On the right-hand side, it's exactly the same, except .get instead of square brackets, and .size instead of .length. The most common thing you're going to do with arrays and array lists is loop over them, and we'll be doing a lot of this kind of thing. So, and hopefully you've done this before. I'm just reminding you how it looks. So here we're looping over all the indices, starting with 0, going up to the length of the list. Here, indices starting at 0, going up to the size of the array list. And then we get out each variable one at a time and assign the values to their own variables. So here I'm going to assign the value at index I to P. Here I'm going to assign the value at index I to P. For people who know about for each loops, there are also for each loops in Java, and we'll talk about those when the year begins. So let's look at an example that puts a bunch of things together. We'll create a list to hold integers. We'll loop 10 times and assign random values to the list. Then we'll try and find the largest thing in the list by initializing a new variable called max_so_far. That will be the largest thing we've seen so far. And we'll initialize it to be the first thing in the list. Then, as we loop over the rest of the list, we'll check each thing and say, is it larger than the maximum we've seen so far? And if it is, that means we have a new maximum, and so we'll save it as the new value of max_so_far. So here's what that pseudocode looks like using arrays and then using ArrayLists. So here we'll create an array that's length 10, and then we're going to loop over the length of the list, so that loops from 0 up to 10, not including 10. And then we generate a random number and save each of those values into each successive variable in the list. Now we declare a new variable called max_so_far, which is going to be initialized to the first thing in the list. And now we loop starting at index 1, because we've already checked index 0. And we'll loop through the rest of the list, and we'll check each value and say, is that thing larger than the maximum so far? And if it is, we'll take that value and save it as the new maximum. So this is like kind of pretty basic for the stuff we'll be doing in AP Computer Science, but I just want to show you kind of what it looks like to put all those elements together. What it looks like for ArrayLists is similar but slightly different. So when we create the array list, notice we don't have 10 here because you always create array lists to be empty. And then in this for loop, we're looping to the length of the list. Here, it doesn't make sense to loop to the length of the num list because right now the num list is length 0. So if I want to make 10 integers inside my array list, I actually have to loop 10 times. And then I'll use add instead of the square brackets. But the random values I'm creating are the same. And then the pattern here is also the same. The only difference is we use .size instead of .length. And we use getI instead of bracket I. Oh, and then this should also say getI. Let me fix that. Ta-da! Fixed. Okay. Last couple of slides. So you can pass lists as inputs to methods. So if I wanted to make a method to count how many of a particular value are in an array, this is where your parameter list goes. And notice I can have an array as one of my parameters. You just have the data type and the variable name. For an array list, same thing. Data type, variable name. I can also pass a list as an output to a method. So if I wanted to have a method that creates an array for me, I could call it makeNumArray. I could tell the method how long I want the array to be, and if it's going to be filled with random values, what the maximum of those random values would be. And so then on the inside, I would actually take size and use it to make a new array, which I'd then return at the end. And in the middle, I could fill it with values. The important thing to notice is that where the green circle is, that's the return type, where you specify the data type of the value that you want to return. And here we want to return an entire list. Same thing for array list, only in this case, it's the data type for the array list, and we have an array list here. Oh, good. That's the end. So if you want to do the type along, feel free. Otherwise, dive into the problem set. But remember, have this available. Just print it out or on your phone or something, like off to the side, so that you can just reference, because it's going to be hard to remember all this if you're not used to using these as part of your everyday. Okay, good luck.